Happy Women's History Month, and welcome to the 4th Women's Media Center Beverly Wettenstein History Lecture. My name is Dr. Janet Dewart-Bell, and as chair of the Women's Media Center Board, I am honored to introduce Clara Bingham, who will be giving today's talk. The Women's Liberation Movement, a blueprint for today. An award-winning journalist, author, and film producer, Clara's work focuses on social justice and women's issues, bringing light to crucial stories such as the women of the 1992 Congress, the Air Force Academy rape scandal of 2003, sexual harassment in Minnesota's taconite mines, and the ravages of mountaintop removal coal extraction in the Appalachian Mountains. Clara's lecture today draws from her latest book, The Movement, How Liberation Transformed America, 1963 to 1973, and will explore the history of the early days of second-wave feminism. Clara is a masterful storyteller, and her talk today will both entertain and inform you. Following her lecture, WMC Board Member, journalist, author, and activist Soraya Chemaly will be in conversation with Clara to explore the themes of her lecture in more detail. Soraya's books include Rage Becomes Her, about the power of women's anger, and most recently, All We Want is Everything, How We Dismantle Male Supremacy. By pulling on the threads of Clara's lecture, Soraya will probe the links between the history of second-wave feminism and the way we, as feminists today, can build on lessons from that time. The Women's Media Center's Beverly Wettenstein series honors women's history and is part of our contribution to the celebration of Women's History Month. Please visit womensmediacenter.com for other lectures in our series, as well to find out more about both Clara and Soraya. And while you are there, you can sign up to receive our newsletter, WMC News. Beverly Wettenstein shared the Women's Media Center's passion for making women visible and powerful in media. She was a renowned journalist, speaker, media critic, and historian who dedicated her career to chronicling the representation of women in national media outlets. She was passionate about commemorating the historical contributions of women and founded the Women in History and Making History Today 365 days a year database. Beverly Wettenstein passed away in 2019, and her endowment has enabled the Women's Media Center to continue to shine a light on the extraordinary historical contributions of diverse women from all walks of life. It is my honor and my pleasure to welcome Clara Bingham.
Hello, I'm Clara Bingham, and I'm delighted to be invited to give you the Women's Media Center's Beverly Wettenstein History Lecture of 2026. The movement is the first comprehensive oral history of the second wave feminist movement. The journey of writing this book took me all over the country, where I interviewed more than 100 people between the ages of 75 and 95 who had helped to create a political, cultural, legal, and social movement, which took place in the boardroom, the bedroom, and the factory floor. I talked to artists, athletes, lawyers, and midwives, educators, psychiatrists, writers, and politicians, radicals and reformers, queer and straight, Black, white, and brown women. Very few of them are famous, but they should all be household names because they each left a legacy behind them that changed lives for millions of younger women. Because the women's liberation movement slogan was "the personal is political," it felt appropriate to tell their stories in their own words as an oral history. When someone had died, I relied on their interviews or memoirs, always looking for examples of their own voice, their own words, of how they lived and how their lives were transformed. When I first started working on this book in September of 2019, I never would have fathomed that just 3 years later, women would be back in the trenches fighting for their basic reproductive rights. The movement was published in August of 2024, during the heat of the presidential election. While promoting the book in August and September and October, it felt as if Kamala Harris's election was inevitable and would be a symbolic victory tour for the women's liberation movement, Shirley Chisholm's dream come true. How times have changed. Now, more than a year into the second Trump administration, I have a new message, which is the stories in this book are a blueprint for the resistance that women need to build now. On this Women's History Month of 2026, feminists are facing the fiercest backlash since Phyllis Schlafly set her sights on defeating the Equal Rights Amendment in 1972. Trump, his administration, and the Heritage Foundation have brazenly revealed their anti-feminist policy goals to refocus women on what they believe is their primary purpose, leaving the workplace and having more children. I'm here to proclaim that no matter how hard the administration may try, it won't succeed in reversing the arc of women's progress. Half of this country's population will not agree to be put back into a 1950s box, a box that dramatically restricted women's educational, professional, and personal choices. The millions of women who rose up in between 1963 and 1973 were the first in human recorded history to succeed in elevating the status of women from second class to first class citizenship. They overcame obstacles that are hard to imagine today. As Robin Morgan wrote in 1970, there's something contagious about demanding freedom, especially where women, who comprise the oldest oppressed group on the face of the planet, are concerned. Let's start at the beginning and remember what life was like in the 1950s and 60s. It was post-World War II America, a time of prosperity when women who had stepped into the workplace during World War II were sent back home. It was a time when manufacturers turned from building bombs to building home appliances. A time when white middle-class families moved en masse to the suburbs, and Madison Avenue's Mad Men created ad campaigns selling the cult of domesticity. To give you a sense of where we were then, in the 1950s, the average marriage age for women dropped to 20. Birth rates skyrocketed, and educational levels plummeted. By the mid-1950s, 60% of women dropped out of college to get married. Women comprised less than 1% of federal judges, less than 4% of lawyers, and less than 7% of doctors. Women couldn't get mortgages, bank loans, or credit cards without their husband or father signing for them. In some states, they couldn't serve on juries or be bartenders unless their husbands or fathers owned the establishment. Women were politically powerless then, In 1963, only 14 out of 435 members of Congress were women. Now there are 155. And there were 0 women governors. Now we have 14. In the late 1960s, newspapers ran classified job ads that were segregated by sex. Most of the job options for women outside of the home were limited to domestic, secretary, teacher, nurse, or flight attendant. That was a very popular one. They were forced to retire at age 32, or if they got engaged, to be married, or God forbid, pregnant. The airlines were essentially selling sex. Here's an advertisement for United Airlines. Only 1 of every 30 girls who apply for stewardess school becomes a United stewardess. Everyone gets warmth, friendliness, and extra care, and someone may get a wife. For example, United Airlines even ran a male-only executive flight from Chicago to New York from 1950 until 1973. The only women allowed on the planes were stewardesses. Enter Betty Friedan and her 1963 book, The Feminine Mystique, inspired by a poll she took for her Smith College 15th reunion. Friedan chronicled the backslide in women's progress during the 1950s and identified the suffering of overeducated white middle-class suburban housewives, which she called the problem that had no name. Her book clearly hit a chord. It sold 3 million copies, and it also sparked a movement. 1 year later, in 1964, Congress passed the sweeping Civil Rights Act, which abolished Jim Crow segregation in the South. No longer could schools, public places, or employers discriminate on the basis of race. But at the last minute, Congressman Howard Smith of Virginia, chairman of the Powerful Rules Committee and a staunch pro-segregationist from Virginia, introduced one word to the bill: sex. He included it in Title VII, which was the part of the bill that addressed employment discrimination. Employers, Smith said, would now be prohibited from discriminating against employees on the basis of race, religion, color, national origin, or sex. Smith's goal was to sabotage the Civil Rights Act, but he didn't succeed. It passed. And it became the first legal advancement since suffrage for the modern women's movement. It spurred the creation of the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, and a year after it opened its doors, 1/3 of the employment discrimination complaints came from women, which surprised all the men who worked there. One of the women in the early feminist Capitol Hill underground was Pauli Murray. She was a civil rights activist from North Carolina, but she became a feminist after she experienced extreme sexism at Howard University Law School. But despite being dismissed by her Black students and professors, she managed to graduate #1 in her class in 1944. Pauli Murray was about 20 years ahead of other white feminists like Betty Friedan. It was Pauli Murray who first came up with the idea of starting an NAACP for women. I consider her the legal architect behind the second wave feminist movement. And she later was joined by powerful Black women leaders like Eleanor Holmes Norton, Fannie Lou Hamer, Florence Kennedy, Barbara Smith, Margaret Sloan, Shirley Chisholm, and others. Pauli Murray joined forces with Betty Friedan and helped found the National Organization for Women. Here is the now iconic photo of the 28 NOW founders at their first organizing conference in Washington, October 1966. Also in 1966 in Boston, a young woman who knew nothing about the National Organization for Women was demanding freedom and equality in an entirely different sphere. Bobby Gibb grew up in Boston, and her father took her to watch the Boston Marathon. When she saw the runners go by, she realized that she had to run that marathon too, but women were not allowed. They were told by their doctors that if they ran long distances, their uteruses would collapse. Women generally didn't play sports because sweating was considered unladylike. But Bobby knew better. She was a natural runner. So she practiced and practiced. And in 1966, she hid behind a bush at the starting line. She covered up with a hoodie. She was wearing nurse shoes because they were the only shoes that were comfortable enough for her to run in. There were no women's running shoes then. And she started off with the first shot. And she made it through the whole race. Halfway through, she had to take off her hoodie, and it became apparent that a woman was running the Boston Marathon. It went out over the airwaves on the radio, and by the time Bobby got to Wellesley, which is an important part of the race, the Wellesley girls, the Wellesley students, were cheering for her. And one woman was singing Ave Maria. Girls were crying. They were so amazed that a woman was running the marathon. And that was the moment that Bobby told me, I really felt at that moment that the world would never be the same again. And it wasn't. This was big national news. It went out all over the world that a woman could actually run the marathon. How shocking. I met Bobby Gibb at her art studio in Rockport, Massachusetts in October of 2019. And she told me that what she was trying to do by running the marathon was change people's consciousness. This is what she said. Once the consciousness is changed in one person, then 2 people, then 10 people, then 10 million people, it becomes a social movement. And then you can get the laws changed, and then you can get the social system changed. But it has to start with a change in consciousness. It would take at least another 4 years for that change of consciousness to sweep the country. But it started bit by bit, woman by woman. By 1968, women had been activists in the anti-war movement and the civil rights movement, but they started to feel disillusioned because their male comrades didn't give them any leadership roles, any speaking roles. And as Robin Morgan told me, all the men wanted us to do was pour their coffee and roll their joints. I met Robin Morgan in her West Village apartment, and she told me that after years of working for the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, the Congress for Racial Equality, and the Students for Democratic Society, she became so fed up with being demeaned by men that she joined New York Radical Women, one of the big early consciousness-raising groups. It was this group of younger, more radical women like Robin who were the movement's secret weapon, because they all had incredibly strong organizing skills from working in civil rights and the anti-war movement. Robin knew that to spread the word, you needed to get press attention. So she, being a former child actor and also a yippie, used her humor to organize the first women's liberation public protest, which took place in 1968 in Atlantic City, New Jersey, during the Miss America pageant. For thousands of women, this was the first time they heard of the movement. Believe it or not, bras were not burned that day, but that's another story I can tell you later. This is what Robin Morgan said about the impact of the protest. This protest caught the public imagination, and other women learned that we existed. The week before the demonstration, there were about 30 women in the New York Radical Women meeting. The week after, there were approximately 150. One of the women who read the press coverage of the protest was Frances Beale. In 1969, Beale and her Black Women's Liberation Committee at SNCC wrote a now famous manifesto, Double Jeopardy, to be Black and female, which I credit with the start of what we now call intersectionality. Frances Beale was 81 in the summer of 2021 when I tracked her down in her senior living center in Oakland, California. She told me that she and her female colleagues were worried that the new Black Power movement had an affinity with the Nation of Islam, which considered abortion genocide. And she knew this would set Black women way back. She knew firsthand how important having abortion rights was for women. When she was in high school, one of her best friends died of a botched abortion. When Beale was 17, she told me the harrowing story of her own abortion, which took place in Harlem on a kitchen table. She very quickly became infected, was rushed to the Harlem hospital where she had a fake wedding ring on, and was taken care of in what was a sepsis ward reserved for women who had botched abortions. This was becoming a major healthcare crisis in America by the late 60s. There was a perfect storm of the women's liberation movement, the counterculture, and hardly any availability of birth control. So women were not able to get birth control if they were married until 1965, and not until 1972 if they were single. Hospitals were flooded with women who had experienced horrifying botched abortions, and over 1 million women a year were risking their lives in America to get these abortions. 1,000 of them died every single year. In Chicago in 1968, a former SNCC organizer named Heather Booth, who went to the University of Chicago, got a call. It was a former civil rights activist friend of hers whose girlfriend desperately needed an abortion. Heather found a doctor who gave her a safe, illegal one. The word got out all over the Midwest that she knew how to help women. So she got her entire group of friends who were part of the Chicago Women's Liberation Group to organize, and they came up with the code name Jane. That was what was used when anyone ever called Heather's phone in her dorm hallway. This grew into a very big, important feminist organization. It was completely underground. They had all sorts of secrets. They knew they were committing major crimes. They hired different doctors who they trusted to do safe abortions. And one doctor they discovered didn't have an MD, which is when they came up with the idea of, if he can do this and he's not a doctor, why can't we? 8 of them apprenticed under him. And he left, and they began performing the abortions themselves. In 1972, they were busted. And 8 of them, they were called the Abortion 8, were destined to go to jail for about 10 years each, until a year later, Roe v. Wade passed in 1973, and they were able to get off. But they were some of the most amazing underground activists. Many of them didn't even consider themselves feminists. They weren't part of an actual movement. They were just helping other women. And in the end, they performed 11,000 abortions in Chicago. 2 years before that bust, in August of 1970, on the 50th anniversary of suffrage, Betty Friedan came up with the idea of holding a huge national strike for equality. Everyone scrambled to organize this strike in all of the major cities all over the country. And the numbers in the end became much bigger than any of the organizers could ever imagine, because all of a sudden they realized there were so many more feminists out there than they even knew. And what was so amazing about this strike, the Women's Strike for Equality it was called, was it included everyone, older women who were reformists and who were conservative, young radicals, women from all backgrounds and ethnicities. And everyone I interviewed, I asked, did you go to that march? And I met people who had been there in Chicago and San Francisco, in Houston, and certainly in New York, where 50,000 women marched down Fifth Avenue. Mayor Lindsay did not give them a permit, so they ended up having so many of them that they took over all of Fifth Avenue. Women came down from their offices and joined in, and this was the first time that I consider this movement to have gone mainstream. It was a viral moment for 1970. Women's liberation was no longer niche, it was no longer freaks, it was all women from all over the country. Also in 1970, in College Park, Maryland, a University of Maryland PhD graduate named Bernice Sandler took the problem of women being virtually banned from most faculty jobs into her own hands. She had applied for a job at University of Maryland. There were many openings, but she was told that she came on too strong. Being an academic, she did her research, and she discovered Executive Order 11246, which was signed by Lyndon Johnson in 1965 and 1968 later, that said that federal contractors were prohibited from employment discrimination on the basis of race and sex. By 1971, Bernice Sandler had filed sex discrimination complaints against 350 colleges and universities. Sandler joined forces with Congresswoman Edith Green, a Democrat from Oregon, a former school teacher, and a member of the Education Department. Green, in June of 1970, held the first hearings on sex discrimination ever on Capitol Hill. At the time, there were strict quotas on how many women universities would accept as students, and only 9% of full professors were women. Together, these two women wrote Title IX, an amendment to the Education Act of 1972. The amendment is very simple. This is how it reads. No person in the United States shall, on the basis of sex, be excluded from the participation in, be denied the benefits of, or be subjected to discrimination under any education program or activity receiving federal financial assistance. Billie Jean King told me this about Title IX. Without the word activity, in those 37 words of Title IX, we wouldn't have women's sports. To give you a sense of the impact, in 1973, 50,000 men had college athletic scholarships versus 50 women. Today, over $200 million is spent on women's athletic scholarships. And the triumph of American women athletes who have won more medals than the men for the last 6 consecutive Olympics is a direct result of Title IX. Their victories can be traced back to Bernice Sandler in College Park, Maryland. Unfortunately, in January of 2026, President Trump revoked Executive Order 11246 as part of his anti-DEI campaign. The same year that Title IX became law in 1972, a Black Congresswoman representing Bed-Stuy, Brooklyn, announced her candidacy for President of the United States. In 1968, Shirley Chisholm was the first Black woman ever elected to Congress. She faced extreme racism and sexism, but that didn't deter her from deciding to run for president. She barnstormed the country, speaking to huge crowds of women, students, anti-Vietnam War activists, LGBTQ, and Black voters, many of whom did not feel represented by the other Democratic primary candidates. Scoop Jackson, Hubert Humphrey, Ed Muskie, John Lindsay, George Wallace, and George McGovern, who would clinch the nomination and lose to Nixon. Chisholm stayed on the campaign trail for the entire primary. Her name was only on the ballot in 8 states, and she won just 2.7% of the popular vote and 152 delegates at the convention in Miami. This is what she wrote about the day she spoke at the Democratic convention. When I got to the convention hall, it was lit up by noise. That was a wonderful moment for me, to see the way all of the delegates received me at that convention, because I'd felt that someday a Black person or female person should run for the presidency of the United States. And now I was a catalyst for change. Well, she certainly was a catalyst for change. And another Black female did run for president. And this time she won 48.3% of the popular vote and 226 electoral votes. So it's important to remember that even in defeat, we've come a long way since Shirley Chisholm's day. Women have spent too many decades taking our basic rights for granted, and being squeamish about calling ourselves feminists, as if it's a dirty word. But meanwhile, we've been making steady progress since the 1960s. 4 out of 9 Supreme Court justices are women, 41% of all lawyers, 1/3 of federal judges, 56% of law students, and 54% of medical students are women. 30% of all doctors are women. Women make up 44% of all NCAA athletes. As much as Donald Trump, Justice Samuel Alito, and the Heritage Foundation wants to turn back the clock, it's just too late to put women back in their 1950s box. But as the quest for equality continues, it's important to remember Coretta Scott King's wise advice. Struggle is a never-ending process. Freedom is never really won. You earn it and win it in every generation. Thank you.
I'm Soraya Chemaly, an author and activist, and also proud board member at the Women's Media Center, and delighted today to be talking to Clara Bingham about her work and ask her some follow-up questions about the lecture that you've just heard. Clara, welcome.
Thank you.
I think we should start actually with the remarkable intro of your book because it sets the stage for our conversation. So
Okay, here we are. I will read you the first paragraph. In 1963, a 20-year-old American woman could not expect to run a marathon or play varsity sports in college. She could only dream of becoming a doctor, scientist, news reporter, lawyer, labor leader, factory foreman, college professor, or elected official. She couldn't get a prescription for birth control, have a legal abortion, come out as a lesbian, or prosecute her rapist. She almost certainly knew nothing about clitoral orgasm or women's history. She could not get a credit card, let alone a mortgage, without the imprimatur of her husband or father. By 1973, the doors to these options and opportunities had cracked open, and a woman turning 20 in 1973 faced a future of possibilities that no generation before had ever experienced.
That's remarkable.
Yeah.
Thank you. And
there you have it.
Yeah, there you have it. And honestly, thank you for this amazing work. And it's so timely because we are living through a time in which many people would like it to be pre-1973 in America. I want to ask you first, when you went through this remarkable period of interviewing, I think you said over 100 people.
Yeah.
To have them describe this moment, was there anything that really disrupted your sense of things as you were listening to them, as you were writing? Because you and I have talked about this before, but there's a sense of forgotten history, but there's also misrepresented history. And I think this movement in particular has distorted, people have a distorted impression maybe of it in their minds. As you conducted these interviews, as you thought about what was happening, did you think, oh, that is actually surprising to me. I didn't realize that as part of this movement.
Well, one of the reasons why I wanted to do this book is so many of these people were getting very old. And I felt like this was the moment to really talk to them about their legacy. And they were at a point in their lives where they were really looking back and getting a sense of the impact that they had had. And I spoke to 100 women from all over the country and all different parts and walks of life. And I did that also because there is this idea that feminists were just bra-burning, man-hating, angry lesbians. That was it.
And mainly white.
And mainly white,
Yes.
and mainly from the West Village.
Yes.
And so I wanted to show that, in fact, it was such a broad, tidal wave. I mean, it was almost more than a movement. It was like a change of consciousness. It's like all of a sudden, everybody, certainly women and many men in this country, understood that the way they had been living their lives for, centuries was actually completely unfair, and that women deserved to be treated like adults.
A real inflection
to
point.
be like, it was a real like turning point. And so there were so many parts of it that people really don't talk about now. And one of them that I discovered and really wanted to explore was the role of women of color. And it was such a fascinating thing because all of the activists had been deeply entrenched in the trenches of the civil rights movement.
Civil rights, that's right.
And so they understood discrimination. They understood race discrimination. And then because they understood that, they segued later on, by the late 60s, into connecting race and gender discrimination. And that's something that Pauli Murray, who I consider the legal architect of the second wave feminist movement, wrote an important, legal paper called Jane Crow and the Law. And so she understood that what was happening to women was very similar to what had been happening to Black Americans, and that they needed to be attacked and addressed in a very similar way.
So what really struck me in some of these narratives was this sense that you did actually have women, a lot of them in the West Village, having the experience of being very left-wing, but cut out of the power structure. And at the same time, you had Black women in the civil rights movement experiencing the same thing in civil rights.
Right.
Right. And they were moving in parallel until they weren't, And so is there a story that really comes to mind where they kind of circled each other and then came together and then actually went apart and then came together again? Is there anything that really strikes you in that history?
Well, one of my favorite moments of them coming together is the Newsweek women.
Yes.
Who were mostly white. There actually were Black women working there who did not want to join what became the first class action for a white collar job environment for sex discrimination on the job. 46 women ended up coming together and suing Newsweek. And so there are two interesting racial aspects to that. There were Black women working at Newsweek who did not want to join this class action because they thought feminism was a white woman's problem.
Right.
They didn't see it as something that was relevant to them. They also probably, and certainly many of the Black women who I spoke to, knew that by becoming a public feminist, they would be shunned in their community for allying themselves with white women.
And the same thing with lesbianism.
Yes. No, absolutely.
That's right.
And that was very closeted for a long time. And Betty Friedan was not at all hospitable to women coming out. But then these white Newsweek women went to the ACLU and met with Eleanor Holmes Norton. And she was a lawyer there and a young lawyer. And they showed her the masthead of Newsweek. And the first half of it was men and the second half was women. And she had already, taken on a bunch of race discrimination lawsuits that were very similar. Black people were just not allowed to have the same jobs. And so this was such a cut and dry, obvious case. But she had to explain to these women of privilege, many of them had gone to 7 sister schools and, were Phi Beta Kappa. So they didn't have a lot of experience with being discriminated against. They were so privileged. But suddenly Eleanor Holmes Norton, who famously freed Fannie Lou Hamer from jail when she'd been badly beaten in Mississippi, she went to Yale Law School, one of the few Black women there, and was just this badass and brilliant. And she had to teach a lot of these women, had to explain to them what was really happening to them.
Were. Yes. What was happening?
You were being discriminated against. You have the rights to fight this because of the Civil Rights Act.
Right. So this is I think a good switch in our conversation, which is you talk to these women about the unbelievable legal reforms they effected, whose legacy changed the world. Can you talk about that? Can you talk about maybe, I don't want to say the top 3, but there are some very clear major legal wins for women that made our lives possible?
Certainly. I mean, the first one that comes to mind is Well, actually, the Civil Rights Act in
Right.
1964, in which one word, sex, was added to Title VII, which was the part of the law that addressed employment discrimination.
Right.
And the whole bill was really about, race discrimination. But then in a last minute moment, which I talked about in my talk, Howard Smith, the Southern racist, but he was a big ERA supporter. So he wasn't doing this entirely as a joke, but he thought by adding sex to Title VII, it could sabotage the bill.
Yes.
It didn't, it kind of got there and became law. The EEOC was started, and women, for the first time, could sue because of sex discrimination. It was completely legal to discriminate against women in the workplace. And it was still at that point legal to discriminate against women in public spaces. I mean, there were plenty of bars and restaurants and airline flights where women were not allowed.
Right.
And
pregnancy discrimination.
And constantly. If you got pregnant and you were a teacher or a stewardess or a nurse, you just got fired immediately. Right. And that was just expected. I mean, if you were a stewardess and you got engaged and had a wedding ring on your finger, engagement ring, fired immediately.
Yeah.
So that was just normal. That's what everyone thought was normal. So this one law, this one word in this, amazing omnibus bill that abolished Jim Crow, started the beginning of turning back Jane Crow, which was, and Polly Murray describes it in this piece, all of the laws on the books that discriminated against women.
Housing, job discrimination. Right.
Exactly.
It had this domino effect that I think probably they hadn't really thought about that deeply.
No, definitely not. It was just, they knew they were just scratching the surface. And then Ruth Bader Ginsburg ends up picking up the ball. She gives a lot of credit to Polly Murray in her first few cases, but she, working for the ACLU in New York, for the Women's Rights Project, ends up figuring out specific laws that discriminated against men.
Yes, that's how she did it.
Right.
Yes.
So she does the Social Security one where Social Security discriminated against a man whose wife had died and she had worked as a teacher, and he was
deprived
due
of that.
her pension, and he was a primary parent of their child. And so she found him in New Jersey. And I got to interview him. He's the most amazing guy.
Really? That's
so
amazing.
They loved her. They ended up being very close friends for life.
Yes.
And so she thought the justices will understand this. If they see that a man has, that like, discriminating by sex is actually should be illegal. But unfortunately, women, sex is not mentioned in the Constitution, as we know, which is why the ERA still is a law.
That's right.
Yeah.
We keep being reminded of. That's right. Okay, so I want to ask you this question. This movement, which you have so exquisitely documented, really revolutionized life. And because of America's status globally, did the same thing. And now we're having another turning point. And I think, and have written a lot about this idea that we're having another movement, that we're having another inflection point, a turning point. But what's interesting to me in this moment is that the ideas and ideals that these women were so invested in, their successes, are really diffuse in the culture. They're diffuse and they're not...
I mean, back then they were.
No, now they are.
Now they are.
Right? So then you had these people making these legal reforms, fighting on the streets, protesting pageants, all the different things that happened. Now, it seems to me, the activism that we would think of as real intersectional, broad-based activism is happening in granular ways without leaders that are recognizable, right? It's much more distributed because of the technology that we have.
Right.
And so I'm wondering if you think there are aspects of what happened then that are happening now, or that maybe have been tessellated into different forms. Because in theory, we have many of the laws, which is why the laws are now being challenged.
Exactly.
Abortion being obviously the big one.
Main one.
But how do you see the intergenerational transfer from this movement to what is happening now?
I think about that a lot. And what was amazing is when this book came out, how it's interesting how a straight history can take on a different meaning, depending on the era that it's being read.
Yes.
And so when it first came out, Trump was not the president, and then now he is, and now we're facing this enormous backlash.
Yeah.
And really the biggest backlash since
for
this, feminists.
Yes,
since
absolutely. And it's fascist. It's like a macho fascist backlash.
Yeah, it's cultural as as well as political. And so I've been thinking that these women really are giving us a blueprint that we need to first obviously honor them for what they did and remember how much they did, but also get some tips from what they did. And one of the things I was thinking about is with abortion. There's a lot of underground organizing going on in the band states now. And they remind me of Jane.
Yes.
Which I, profile in the book. I interviewed a bunch of women who were part of the Janes, which was an underground abortion network where they found doctors and very secretly, it was really quite an operation. And they had code names, they had code words, they had special places. No one who worked there knew everything about it. And it functioned for many years.
It saved many lives.
And my guess is that, something similar to this, probably with the use of mifepristone,
is happening now.
Is happening.
For sure.
Yeah. And so we know that women are organizing there to make sure that other women who need it can get abortion medication. And let's hope they're not performing their own abortions.
No, they don't need to so much. There is self-abortion guidance, but they don't need to the same way.
That's also the big difference. It's important to remember. we have lost this incredibly crucial right.
Yes.
That we had for 49 years nationally. And back then, the estimates were that approximately 1,000 women a year died.
Yes.
And now we know of 8 that ProPublica has dug up.
Yes.
I'm sure there are more who died because their miscarriages or their pregnancies were mistreated by the hospitals because they were so afraid of there being a live fetus that they didn't want to damage. So the women died instead.
Right. And you have all the criminalization that's happening too, though. Like in addition to the
being sent to jail because of the way you dispose,
fetal remains, and everything. That's all of that.
So there's a lot going on that's really terrible, but we don't see the bloodbath that there was back then because of technology.
Changed. That's right. Yeah. Which is actually all right. We're going to switch. We're just like we'll come back to that. Can we talk about Title IX and not just the remarkable just the transformation of sports and its impacts on women's lives?
Okay, well, actually what happened is it was passed with flying colors in both the House and the Senate in 1972. So did ERA. And what's incredible is back then, feminism was a bipartisan, quite politically popular issue. And it was part of the Education Act of 1972. And the NCAA fought it for over 10 years. So it didn't, at least the sports part, didn't get activated until deep into the 80s. And they think that it's all about sports, but the fact is there were very strict quotas about women being able to get into medical school, law school, any co-ed school. And so just as students, women couldn't get educated. There were women who wanted to go to med school, but women weren't allowed to go to med school. I
don't think most people realize that. I
they
think they really think of it in terms of sports.
Right. And so it started because Bernice Sandler wanted a job as a faculty member at the University of Maryland, and she was told, "You're too outspoken," and so she realized, it's really just because I'm a woman. Is this legal? And she looked it up and found out, in fact, anyone who receives federal contracts can't discriminate on the basis of sex or race. And so she sued all of these colleges and eventually wrote Title IX with Edith Green, the congresswoman. But they didn't even think about sports when they were writing Title IX. It was literally put in, the word activity was put in very last minute. There was never a hearing about it. No one who, on those committees thought what that meant. And so it was interpreted afterwards as sports. And so and then of course it became what it was. And we think of sports as sports, but what it really was a ticket to get to college. There were 50,000 men who were receiving sports college
track.
scholarships,
That's
and 50 women in
Mhm.
1973. So like it was another barrier to entry, not being able to go because of sports. So, I interviewed a bunch of women who were with Billie Jean King in the original 9, and they, broke off from the USTA. There's such a great story. And they were going to college, and the men had a tennis team, and the women didn't have a tennis team.
They didn't. They had
so they had
no
to play with the
resources.
guys.
That's right.
Julie Heldman went to Stanford, and she had to play with the men's team so that she could just practice, because there was no women's team. So there just wasn't really much in terms of women's sports. And sports are so much more than just sports. It's really about confidence and,
Leadership
strength,
and
leadership,
negotiating, and all the professional benefits that stem from that.
Yeah.
So today, what you're writing about here, for very young people, I think, can feel like ancient history, because there's so much that we can take for granted. Going to school, we take for granted. Playing sports, we take for granted. But there is something, I think, happening now, which is that intimate life, personal relationships, particularly for Gen Z, are the ground of political conflict. So we see the political polarization of Gen Z that is a gendered polarization. And there is this sense, which I've heard young women describe, that this is where they have to fight their generation's feminist battles. And yet these women were also doing that.
Yeah.
In addition to the legal reforms or the public protests and the cultural norm changing. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Well, I always say that this happened in the boardroom and the bedroom.
Yes.
And the personal is political was the slogan, and it had a huge impact on people's personal lives. And because at that time women were very much boxed into the role of being housewives and mothers.
And marital rape was
legal. And there was some premarital sex, but that was mostly among more bohemian people. And so women were sort of stuck in marriages. It was very hard there wasn't a lot of no-fault divorce.
That's right.
And so they were stuck in these marriages that they didn't necessarily, suddenly they kind of woke up to who they wanted to be. And they realized, I actually need to be an artist, or I need to be a politician, and I can't just do this. And it disrupted a lot of marriages. Alex Case Schulman wrote this fantastic article called The Marriage Contract, which blew everyone's minds, because she and her husband wrote a contract about who was responsible for what.
Which
and
people are
they'd
currently
signed it.
litigating.
Really?
Yes. There's an entire movement, right? Which is, how do we manage emotional labor, domestic care? How do we make it fair?
Right.
Which is what she was talking about.
Right. And it was a contract between husband and wife, and because she just wanted parity. And of course, all the feminist movement wanted was for women to have choices, right? If you want to be an at-home mom,
do it.
Great.
Right.
Have a ball. That's fantastic if you have someone who can support you. But Alex Kate Schulman wanted to be a writer and realized she could only do that if her husband helped her.
Right.
And that really, I believe that women are never going to get where we really want to get to unless men change too.
Absolutely.
And that it's got to be a partnership.
Yeah. And the thing about it is, I think that people think of feminism in the sex segregated way, that it's about women, it's a women's issue. But you can't change women and their lives and notions of femininity without masculinity being revolutionized.
No, exactly.
It's not a choice. And that's part of the conflict that we're having today.
Right. Just a little example that I was thinking of, back in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, and even 80s, only women were flight attendants. Only women were nurses. Right. Now you get on a plane and half the flight attendants are men. Or you go to a hospital and plenty of the nurses are men. And so this movement opened up jobs for men as well. Right. It sort of blew open this ridiculous sort of gender structuring and it's just about people wanting to be able to be who they are. Right. It's just as simple as that.
I think what's sort of disturbing to me in this moment is that whether implicit or explicit, like occupational sex segregation is being reinstituted because of algorithmic bias, for example, right? And you have all of this technology that incorporates historic bias in ways that's very hard to see, very hard to disrupt. And I'm wondering if you associate this movement with a particular type of media that is outdated now. We have our new media, we have the internet, we have AI, and that's transforming all these movements. But do you think of this movement in terms of the media they had and what it meant to them?
Absolutely. And I had to sort of cut a bunch of it, but it was about using the media, and back then, in order to get the word out. And then it was obviously legacy media, and there were newspapers, and there were 3 television networks, and everyone read them.
Yes.
And so
And women also protested at all of them.
Yes, exactly. Well, the
That's right.
newspapers were well, first of all, there were class actions in all of them from the women who worked there, because they were discriminated against. And the newspapers were protested against forever because they had classified job ads that were segregated by sex. And they did not want to give them up because it meant they got twice as much, money for advertising the same one job. But anyway, it was a big deal when Kate Millett was put on the cover of Time magazine. A very big deal. Millions of people saw that. So, when women went on to important talk shows, which they did all, Betty Friedan and Gloria Steinem did that all the time, and they would debate Phyllis Schlafly, and that was sort of what everybody watched. Everyone listened to the, anchors of the 3 news channels talking about what was going on in the news. And so there was much, there was a lot, it was much more uniform what people were learning.
It was all mass media, all having the same experience.
Ms. Magazine comes out in 1972, and it just spreads like wildfire because there's such a need. So many, all over the country, women were subscribing and sending in these wild letters. I mean, it's famous. There's a wonderful book of the letters that came into Ms., just by the bundle of women saying, thank God, I've been wanting to read this, or I've hidden it from my husband, and there was such a need for that, publication. And they touched millions and millions of people. So I think the media was incredibly powerful back then.
Yeah, more concentrated. And also, our organization was founded by Robin Morgan, Gloria Steinem, and Jane Fonda. And I know that you talked to, very funny conversations, favorite funny conversations. And what I loved about many of your conversations was how funny people are.
People forget that too.
Because, and again, I think they forget it, but they were also always being told that feminists are humorless, or they just can't take a joke. There's all of this, and they're remarkably brilliant and funny people. But I think you have a story about the snide mockery and pushback against Ms. Magazine. I don't know if you remember it.
Yes. I would actually have to take a look, but wasn't, I think it was Eric Severide. It was one of the anchors.
Who said,
this is the most terrible magazine. Here, let's just find it.
Yeah, he says something, and then
he has to take it back.
Yes.
He said it's not going to last more than, a day or a month or 2. Ms. Magazine comes out January of 1972. No one really knows how it's going to do. And Harry Reasoner, who was the ABC Evening News anchor, said that it would never last. He said, I'll give it 6 months before they run out of things to say. And then 5 years later, he had to apologize. And then when it also came out, the Boston Globe said, the first issue of Ms. breathes of selfishness that beggars description. It is like looking at the slides of carcinoma in a cancer magazine. A single tone vibrates through the whole of this first edition. It is C sharp on the untuned piano. This is the note of petulance, of bitchiness, of nervous fingernails screeching across a blackboard. I mean, that just gives you a sense. This was common.
So all I hear with this is the manosphere's feminism is cancer. You know, I mean, this
Yeah,
is
it's
the
the
same
same.
thing,
It's the
but now
same.
it's on a
Yeah,
fire hose,
right,
and it's
right. This
very
was just
profitable.
in the Boston
Yes,
Globe.
that's
you
very
know,
funny. So
for their readers,
yes,
in period.
so much has changed for women, and so little for some men.
Yeah,
Really,
no, exactly. But it shows that basically, if you look under the hood, misogyny hasn't gone anywhere.
Not at all.
You know,
And,
it just
and the,
goes into
and it's-
hiding.
That's right.
But it just doesn't go away.
Mhm.
And I don't know what it will ever, I don't think it ever will.
Mm.
You know, and I think that we have to just understand that misogyny is there, is this sort of, you know, elephant in the room. And sometimes it's, you know, couth to
Mhm.
hide it.
Right. And other times,
And other times, like
yes.
right now, it's, you know, we're seeing it.
It's a badge of honor.
In a way, it's a badge of honor because of who our president is.
Mhm.
And so he's allowed it to come out in full bloom.
Mhm.
So we're actually seeing it for really what it really is.
Yeah, actually, I'm just like, okay, now we
Yeah,
don't have
thanks
to
for
convince
revealing
anyone. Thank you
yourselves.
so much. Yes,
Yeah,
I know.
right.
Makes it easier to do this. So we only have a little bit of time left. So I wanted to talk about how the arc of your book sort of goes full circle and you end up with Black women's feminist organizations. Why did you do it that way? And can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Well, we start a little with really how incredibly important Black women were to this movement and because of their experience in the civil rights movement. But eventually, Black women started to really feel that they needed their own groups. You know, they were always, you know, the one Black woman and a consciousness raising group of 20 white women who really didn't understand them, were insensitive. And so a group of Black women in New York started their own national organization.
Yes.
And it was very exciting. And they had their first conference at Riverside Church in 1973. Shirley Chisholm spoke, Eleanor Holmes Norton spoke. There were so many, Fannie Lou Hamer spoke. There were so many important figures. And I interviewed Barbara Smith, who's one of my very favorites, just brilliant social, literary critic. And she was young and she went to that wide-eyed and there were all of these iconic women making it okay to be a feminist because it wasn't necessarily in the Black community then okay to be and they found their own sisterhood that was really, really important. And of course, later on, decades later, Black feminism is such an important part of the movement and is much more central to the movement than it was then. But it was really all started in 1973.
So today, we know what's going on. We have this resurgent, militant, masculine, supremacist world. What lessons can you draw from what you learned in these interviews and in your book for people today?
If we think of it, the sexism we women now are witnessing is still not nearly as bad as what the women in the 60s and 70s faced. And I mean, women were just considered to be mentally and physically feeble.
And legally children.
And legally children. So they had to really put up against a lot. And they used humor and they used sisterhood.
Yes.
So instead of just being angry, and I mean, we're so shocked because we didn't really think it could be this bad. But I think because they already knew it could be this bad, they were always moving on. They weren't focusing on how awful the men were. They were focusing on what they needed to do next. And I think one of the really powerful instruments of this movement was the consciousness raising group.
Yes.
And there were thousands of them. Every single woman I talked to was in one or two or three. And they met every week and they would talk about everything. And it was very revolutionary at the time. And I feel like women really need that sisterhood now.
Do you not feel that the internet serves proxy feminist consciousness raising? It's not organized, it's not structured.
Yeah.
But you really can't escape the profusion of feminist voices.
Yeah.
And
certainly on our feeds.
Yes, that's right. Yeah. I mean, certainly not on our feeds. You can certainly escape it if if you don't tune your algorithm that way. I totally agree with you.
I don't know if my son's feed has,
No, I agree with you. I agree with
angry women in their cars talking about what happened in Alabama.
Yes, that's right. But I do think there's something to the liberation of that
Yes.
mechanism, right? So that willingly or not, people are just exposed to these ideas. I do think it would be nice if it were more structured sometimes.
Yeah.
The way you're describing.
Yeah, but you know what? This movement wasn't, back
Yeah.
then wasn't very
It's very
structured
it was
either.
very
It was
organic.
super organic. It was
Yes.
very diverse. It was all different kinds of people all over the country.
Yes.
And boy, if they had had social media,
Can you imagine? I know.
You know?
Sometimes I was reading and I was like, oh my gosh, can you imagine?
But the only problem with social media, I mean, among many, but one of the problems with social media is that I feel like you can click like instead of hitting the streets.
That's true.
That people feel like if they're at least, making an effort to watch this stuff, that's all they need to do. And so I just think that there isn't enough in-person, convening. And that I think there's so much power in that.
And I think that's one of the lessons of your book, which is, again, the solidarity, the community, the actual gathering of people, not online.
Right.
Yes,
exactly.
That's an important place. But what they really had was coming together that way.
Right. And so we were all siloed in our, bedrooms, scrolling and kind of amazed. I'm always amazed at how funny and wry and smart so many people are on Instagram or whatever whatever your forum is. And that's great. And everyone can have a voice. And if they're good, they go viral.
Right.
But it's really not the same as 50,000 women turning up in August of 1970 on Fifth Avenue and walking all the way from Columbus Circle down to Bryant Park and joining arms, and women coming down from the office buildings and joining. And that is where real power lies.
Yes.
That's when it's sort of like the Women's March, which I'm sure you went to. I mean, to be with 1 million women in person, that was one of the most exultant, joyful days of my life.
So you'll appreciate this as an historian. I was at a conference. It was for media at risk. It was a media at risk conference, and there was a man talking about a book that he'd just written, and he was very insistent that there was simply no pushback to Trump when he was elected, and there was no pushback to the authoritarianism, and he went through the whole speech. And at the end, I sort of put my hand up and I said, globally, the biggest protest that ever, at that point, had ever happened was the Global Women's March. And I just am wondering what you did with that. And he said, well, I have a chapter on gender in my book.
God.
And I said, all your other chapters are about gender too. But you have to admit that was a massive confrontation, and it was immediate. So
immediate.
It was immediate.
That was what was so great about it. Just like
right. But I do
so
think
fast.
that is actually why the success of this movement is why we're in the backlash we're in. It's not because it failed.
Absolutely, and that's why I'm so crazed by this idea of feminism has failed.
Yes.
In this used two ways.
Another myth making.
By the progressives, or younger women saying, "Hey, you got why don't we have our abortion rights? You guys screwed up."
Right.
And then of course by right-wing people who are like, feminism has screwed up women.
And
they should all stay at
lives.
home.
That's right.
This is awful.
That's right.
And the workplace is feminized. And so it's such an easy, it's such an easy target.
It is an easy, and that's the misogyny, right?
Right.
But to end on a good note, thank you so much for documenting this history. It's so important.
Well, it was my pleasure.
Yes, and
it was.
I hope everybody reads.
Oh, me too.
Yeah.
I think we can learn a lot from these
right.
women, and that they've given us a blueprint for our own future, for the resistance.
Yes, thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Yes, and thank you for joining us today.
All right.